The windows became my worst fear because my reflection was no longer mine. My name is Joseph, and I've been the overnight janitor at Blackstone Tower for 15 years. I used to find comfort in the solitude of empty halls and the hum of fluorescent lights. Now I can barely look at my own shadow without my heart racing. This is my story, and I swear every word of it is true. It all started on a Tuesday night, or rather Wednesday morning, at 2 a.m. I was on the 42nd floor, the one that always gave me the creeps. The layout was different there, wider corridors, higher ceilings, and more mirrors than any other floor. The company that leased it dealt with some high-tech stuff I never understood, but that night I understood one thing crystal clear. Something was very, very wrong. I've always been a night owl, which is why this job suited me perfectly. After my divorce 5 years ago, these quiet hours became my solace. The empty offices, the sleeping computers, the view of the city lights from 50 stories up. It all became a kind of sanctuary. I knew every inch of this building from the basement storage rooms to the executive suites on the top floor. But the 42nd floor, that was different. Even before that night, there was something off about it. The air felt thicker somehow, and sounds echoed strangely in its halls. The few times I'd run into the day crew who worked there, they always seemed on edge, their smiles a little too forced. But a job's a job, and I wasn't about to let some heebie-jeebies keep me from doing mine. I was mopping near the east-facing windows, half listening to a podcast about unsolved mysteries. The irony of that choice still haunts me. As I dragged the mop across the polished floor, I caught a glimpse of movement in the window's reflection. Nothing unusual, just me working, or so I thought. I paused to adjust my earbuds, and that's when I saw it. My reflection's hand moved to its ear a full second after I did. I blinked hard, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, my reflection was staring right at me, even though I was looking down at the mop. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. I'd been working these night shifts for years. Lack of sleep was bound to catch up with me someday. I decided to finish the floor quickly and head to the break room for some coffee. As I worked my way around the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every window I passed seemed to hold a version of me that was slightly off. A tilt of the head when I was looking straight ahead. A smile when my face was dead serious. I tried to rationalize it. Weird lighting, stress. Maybe that leftover pizza I had for dinner was bad. But then I reached the conference room with its wall-to-wall windows overlooking the city. I saw myself there, mop in hand, but this reflection was smiling. Not just a small grin, but a wide, toothy smile that stretched unnaturally across its face. I dropped the mop and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection didn't move. It stood there, still smiling, as if enjoying my fear. I rubbed my eyes, pinched myself, did everything I could think of to wake myself up from what had to be a nightmare. But when I looked again, it was worse. The reflection had moved closer to the glass, its nose almost touching it, eyes wide and unblinking. I ran. I didn't care about looking crazy or leaving my job unfinished. I just needed to get away from those windows, away from that thing that was wearing my face. I sprinted to the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly until the doors finally opened. As the elevator descended, I tried to calm myself. I had a history of anxiety stemming from a car accident years ago that left me wary of reflective surfaces for months. Maybe this was just an extreme relapse brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew this was different. This was real. The elevator seemed to take an eternity with each floor it passed. I felt my panic rising. What if the doors opened and I saw that twisted version of myself waiting for me? I pressed myself into the corner, avoiding the mirrored walls as much as I could. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement in them, a flicker of something that wasn't me. But I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look. When I reached the lobby, I hesitated. The glass doors leading outside suddenly looked like a trap. What if my reflection was waiting for me out there, in every car window and storefront? I was trapped between my fear of staying in the building and my terror of leaving it. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the security desk. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There, on the computer monitor, was my reflection again. But this time, it was knocking on the screen from the inside, its smile now a pleading expression, as if it wanted to be let out. I'd love to tell you that I bravely confronted whatever was happening, that I solved some ancient mystery or battled a dark entity. But the truth is, I ran. I burst out of those doors and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove home in a daze, avoiding every reflective surface I could. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I called in sick, unable to face the thought of returning to that building. My small apartment became both a sanctuary and a prison. I covered all the mirrors, turned off my phone, and kept the TV dark. But even then I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. In those quiet hours, my mind raced with possibilities. Was I losing my grip on reality, or had I stumbled upon something beyond my understanding? I thought about the odd behaviors of the day crew on the 42nd floor, wondering if they had experienced similar things. Had they simply been better at hiding their fear, or was I somehow special in my ability to see what was really happening? I considered quitting my job, but the thought of trying to explain why to a new employer seemed impossible. Who would believe me? More importantly, who would hire someone who claimed to be running from their own reflection? After a week, desperation and the need for a paycheck drove me back to Blackstone Tower. I requested a transfer to the day shift, spinning a story about trouble sleeping that wasn't entirely untrue. My supervisor was surprisingly understanding, almost relieved, as if he'd been expecting something like this. Now, I still work at Blackstone Tower, but I can't bring myself to go above the 40th floor. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see my reflection moving on its own in the lobby's shiny floor or a chrome trash can. But I never look directly at it. I'm too afraid of what I might see. Looking back, the day shift is different. The bustle of people, the constant noise, it all helps to keep the memories at bay. But in quiet moments, when I'm alone in a restroom or passing by a darkened office, I feel it again. That sensation of being watched, of something just waiting for me to let my guard down. I've tried to research the building's history, looking for any clues about what might be happening on the 42nd floor. I've found whispers of strange occurrences, of employees requesting transfers or quitting suddenly, but nothing concrete. It's as if the truth is always just out of reach, like a reflection that moves when you're not looking directly at it. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night, and now, every time I pass a window or a mirror, I find myself wondering, Is that really my reflection, or is it something else waiting for another chance to break free? Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about going back, about taking the elevator up to the 42nd floor and confronting whatever is there. But then I remember the smile on my reflection's face, the way it seemed to hunger for something I couldn't understand, and I know I never will. So I stay on the lower floors, clinging to the safety of daylight and crowds, but always, always watching the reflections around me, never quite sure if what I'm seeing is real or if somewhere in some mirror or window, the real Joseph is trapped, pounding silently for help that will never come. I've been driving trucks for nearly 3 decades, and I've seen my fair share of weird on the road, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me last month on that godforsaken stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada. Even now, weeks later, I find myself hesitating before I get behind the wheel of any vehicle. The open road used to be my home, my sanctuary. Now it's the stuff of nightmares. It started like any other long-haul run. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, a route I'd driven more times than I could count. The dispatcher had called me in last minute. The original driver had called in sick, and they needed someone reliable to make the delivery on time. That should have been my first warning sign. In all my years of trucking, I'd never known Jake to miss a shift, but hey, people get sick, right? I set out just as the sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple fading to inky black. The night was moonless with a light drizzle that made the road gleam under my headlights. Perfect conditions for a quiet drive, or so I thought. I had my thermos of coffee, my audiobook playing low on the speakers, and 1,200 miles of open road ahead of me. About 3 hours in, somewhere east of Fallon, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first, I figured it was just a trick of the headlights, some reflection or shadow playing tricks on my tired eyes. But as the miles rolled by, that figure kept following me, always the same distance away. I'm not the jumpy type. Hell, after years on the road, you learn to brush off the strange and unexplained. I've seen things that would make most people's skin crawl, accidents that defied explanation, hitchhikers that vanished into thin air, lights in the sky that no plane could make. So I ignored it, cranked up the radio to drown out the patter of rain, and focused on the asphalt ribbon unfurling before me. But it didn't go away. Every time I glanced in that mirror, there it was, a dark silhouette, barely visible in the misty night, but undeniably there, always in the corner of my eye, always the same distance behind me. I tried changing speeds, slowing down, speeding up, but nothing made a difference. That figure remained constant, like it was tethered to my truck by some invisible cord. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another trucker on the same route, keeping a steady pace. But as the hours wore on and the shadows deepened, that explanation felt hollower and hollower. No headlights ever illuminated that figure, no matter how dark it got. And trust me, it got dark. The rain picked up as I crossed into Utah, drumming a nervous rhythm on the roof of my cab. The windshield wipers squeaked back and forth, like a metronome counting down to something I didn't know. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I realized I'd been grinding my teeth so hard my jaw ached. That's when things started getting really weird. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the road ahead. I slowed down, squinting into the gloom, and that's when I saw them. shadows darting across the highway. Not animals, not other vehicles, just shapes moving too fast, too erratically. They flitted across my headlights, gone almost before I could register them, but with each passing mile they seemed to grow bolder, larger, staying in view just a little longer each time. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. The rational part of my brain kept saying it was just my imagination, just fatigue playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't normal road hypnosis or sleep deprivation. This was something else entirely. And all the while, that figure remained in my mirror, watching, waiting. I tried calling into dispatch, hoping the sound of another human voice might ground me, but all I got was static, a harsh, grating noise that set my teeth on edge. I flipped through the radio stations, desperate for anything to fill the silence. Nothing but white noise and snatches of garbled voices too distorted to make out. As I approached the outskirts of Salt Lake City, a sound cut through the steady thrum of my engine. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain and road noise, but it grew louder, more insistent. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It rose and fell like some hellish wind, forming almost words that danced just at the edge of comprehension. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled into the first rest stop I saw, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. I needed to clear my head, reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The brake hissed as I brought the rig to a stop, the sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn quiet. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the sickly glow of flickering sodium lights. I climbed down from the cab on shaky legs, the cold rain shocking me back to reality. My boots squelched in puddles as I paced back and forth, trying to work some warmth back into my stiff limbs. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see on the highway behind me. Nothing, just an empty road stretching back into the fog-shrouded night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe it had all been in my head after all. The long hours, the monotony of the highway, the rain, they can do strange things to a man's mind. I've heard stories from other truckers, tales of hallucinations and near misses, born of exhaustion and isolation. I was about to climb back into the truck when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from just beyond the circle of light cast by the rest stop's lamps. A steady splash, 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 splash that sent ice water down my spine. I froze, my hand on the door handle. Every instinct screamed at me to get in the truck, to drive away as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. Its movements jerky and unnatural. As it stepped into the light, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as we stood there face to not face. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, drowning out even the sound of the rain. The thing tilted its head, an almost quizzical gesture that sent fresh waves of terror through me. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me. I don't remember getting back in the truck. The next thing I knew, I was tearing down the highway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. The speedometer needle crept past 80, past 90, but it didn't feel fast enough. Nothing felt fast enough to outrun the memory of that finger pointing at me, marking me. The sky was just starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn when I blew past the Welcome to Colorado sign. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, without looking in the rearview mirror even once. By the time I reached the delivery depot, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my eyes were burning from the effort of staying awake. I made my delivery in a daze, barely registering the concerned looks from the warehouse staff. I handed in my resignation on the spot, ignoring my supervisor's protests and questions. I haven't set foot in a truck since. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those footsteps coming, closer, closer. The rational part of me says it was just a hallucination, a waking nightmare born of too many hours on the road. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something in a mirror, a tall, thin shape just at the edge of vision, and the terror comes flooding back. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent countless hours trying to convince myself it was all just a hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. I've talked to therapists, to sleep specialists, trying to find some explanation that doesn't end with, and that's when I saw the monster. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I experienced. I don't drive much these days, not if I can help it, but sometimes when I'm on a lonely road at night, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure once again, always the same distance away, always watching. And in those moments, I hold my breath and pray to whatever might be listening that this time, just this time, the mirror will show nothing but an empty road behind me. It's normal to feel a little off working late in a mortuary, but I didn't expect to hear them talk. The first time it happened, I was hunched over Mrs. Abernathy's body, carefully applying her favorite shade of lipstick, Crimson Sunset. Her daughter had insisted. The mortuary was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Then, barely audible, I heard it, a whisper, light as a breath, coming from somewhere in the room. I straightened up, my heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. Of course, there was no response. I was alone in the mortuary, as I had been countless nights before. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Too many late nights, too much coffee. I bent back over Mrs. Abernathy, determined to finish her makeup before calling it a night. That's when I heard it again, a soft murmur, like someone talking in their sleep. It seemed to be coming from... No, that was impossible. I forced myself to look at Mrs. Abernathy's face, half expecting to see her lips moving. They weren't, of course. She lay there, peaceful and still, just as she had been when her family brought her in. I hurried through the rest of my work that night, my hands shaking slightly as I packed up my tools. As I locked up the mortuary, I promised myself I'd take a few days off. Clearly, I was overworked, but I didn't take time off. The Callahan mortuary had been in my family for generations, and I couldn't bear the thought of letting my parents down. They had entrusted me with the business when they retired, and I was determined to keep it running smoothly no matter what. So, I came back the next night and the night after that. For a while, everything was normal. I went about my work, preparing the deceased with the care and respect they deserved. I even started to feel silly about that night with Mrs. Abernathy. Then, about a week later, it happened again. I was working on Mr. Peterson, a kindly old man who had passed away in his sleep. As I was sewing his lip shut, a necessary but always unsettling part of the job, I heard it, a whisper, clearer this time. "It doesn't hurt," the voice said, so close it could have been right next to my ear. I jerked back, the needle slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but I was alone except for Mr. Peterson on the table before me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the radio in the office, left on by mistake, or a passerby on the street outside. But deep down, I knew the voice had been too close, too clear. From that night on, it became a regular occurrence. Whispers in the night, fragments of conversations I couldn't quite make out. Always when I was alone, always when I was working with the bodies. I started dreading the nights I had to work late, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. Who would believe me? I threw myself into my hobby, spending hours working on complex jigsaw puzzles in my free time. The methodical process of fitting pieces together soothed me, gave me a sense of control I was losing in other aspects of my life. But even as I lost myself in the intricate patterns, I couldn't shake the memory of those whispers. Weeks passed, and the voices grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were talking to me. "We know you can hear us," they'd say. "Don't be afraid." But I was afraid, terrified, in fact. I started making mistakes in my work, my hands trembling as I tried to ignore the constant murmur of voices around me. My parents noticed, asked if everything was all right. I lied, told them I was just tired. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday night in November. I was preparing a young woman who died in a car accident. As I worked, the voices started up again, louder than ever. "She's so young," one voice said mournfully. "Too young?" another agreed. "Tell her family she loves them," a third voice insisted. I dropped my tools, backing away from the table. "Stop it," I whispered, then shouted, "Stop it!" The voices fell silent for a moment, then came back in a cacophony of whispers, all talking at once. I couldn't make out individual words anymore, just a rising tide of noise that threatened to drown me. I ran from the mortuary, not even bothering to lock up behind me. I drove home in a daze, my hand shaking on the steering wheel. When I got home, I called my parents. "I can't do it anymore," I told them, my voice breaking. "I'm sorry, but I can't." They were confused, concerned. They asked what was wrong, if something had happened. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How could I explain that the dead were speaking to me? In the end, I simply said that the stress of the job had become too much, that I needed to step away, to find something else. They were disappointed, I could tell, but they understood, or at least they thought they did. I left the family business and found a job in an office, where the only voices I heard were from the living. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, sure that I can hear whispers in the darkness. And sometimes, in my weakest moments, I wonder if maybe I should have stayed, if maybe those voices had something important to say. But then I remember the fear, the creeping dread that filled my nights, and I know I made the right choice. After all, some conversations are better left unfinished. After the second collapse, I realized we weren't alone down there. The mine was watching us. The rocks had eyes, and they were hungry. But let me back up because you need to understand how I got here, sitting in this dingy bar on the outskirts of Elko, Nevada, my hand shaking as I down another shot of whiskey. My name's George, and I'm from Kansas originally. I've got a wife and 2 kids back home, but the job market was tough. When I heard about the good money in Nevada's mineral mines, I jumped at the chance. That was 4 months ago. 4 months of descending into the belly of the earth, chipping away at stone that's been there since before mankind learned to walk upright. At first, it was just a job. Hard work, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. My buddy Mike and I would joke around to pass the time, our headlamps cutting through the darkness as we worked our way deeper into the mine. We'd talk about our families, our dreams, anything to distract from the tons of rock looming above us. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, a strange formation here, an odd shadow there. I'd turn my head, and out of the corner of my eye I could swear I saw something move. But when I looked directly at it, it was just another rock face, cold and unmoving. Mike noticed it too. "Hey, George," he said one day, his voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. "Does that look like a face to you?" He pointed his lamp at a section of wall we'd just exposed. I squinted, and for a moment I could see it. 2 deep hollows for eyes, a jutting outcrop for a nose, and a jagged line that could have been a mouth. I laughed it off. "You're seeing things, man. Too much time underground is messing with your head." But as the days wore on, these faces seemed to multiply. They were everywhere, watching us from the ceiling, peering out from behind support beams, their rocky features twisted into expressions of what I can only describe as hunger. Then came the first collapse. We were working a new section when we heard it, a low rumble that quickly grew into a roar. Mike and I ran, the sound of falling rock chasing us through the tunnels. We made it out, but barely. As we stood there, covered in dust and gasping for air, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like laughter echoing from deep within the mine. The company called it a natural accident, just one of those things that happen in this line of work. They shored up the collapsed section and sent us back in. But things were different after that. The air felt thicker, heavier. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our tools and the occasional groan of settling rock. I started having nightmares. In them I was lost in the mine, wandering endless tunnels as the faces in the rock leered at me. They whispered things, terrible things, in a language I couldn't understand but somehow knew was ancient and evil. Mike tried to keep our spirits up, but I could tell he was feeling it too. His jokes became forced, his laughter hollow. We'd catch each other jumping at shadows, flinching at every creak and groan of the mine around us. Then came the second collapse. We were deeper than ever before, working a rich vein of minerals. I was chipping away at the rock face when I heard Mike scream. I turned just in time to see the ceiling come down on him. I ran toward him, but the ground beneath my feet shifted, and suddenly I was falling. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was in complete darkness. My headlamp was gone and I could taste blood in my mouth. I called out for Mike, but there was no answer, just silence. And then something else, a scraping sound, like stone against stone coming from all around me. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, my hand shaking so bad I almost dropped it. When I finally got it on, I wish I hadn't. The faces were there, no longer just vague impressions in the rock. They were moving, shifting, their mouths opening and closing as if they were speaking. and they were all looking at me. I ran. I don't know how I found my way out. Maybe the mind let me go, deciding I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe it was saving me for later. All I know is I didn't stop running until I hit daylight, and I haven't been back since. The company says it was another accident. They're still digging, still sending men down into that hole. But I know the truth. That mine is alive, and it's hungry. And sooner or later, it's going to want to feed again. I've tried telling people, but who's going to believe me? A miner who's had one too many close calls? They say stress and fear are playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. I know what's down there. So I sit here in this bar night after night, drinking to forget and hoping that somehow, some way, I can warn others before it's too late. Because that mine is patient. It's been there for millions of years, and it'll be there for millions more. And it's always watching, always waiting for its next meal. If you're smart, you'll stay away from Elko. Find work somewhere else, anywhere else. Because once that mine gets a taste of you, it never lets go. And who knows, maybe one day, you'll be just another face in the rock, watching and waiting for the next poor soul to wander too deep into the earth. I could handle the long shifts, but seeing the patients I'd lost, that was too much. It started innocently enough, just glimpses out of the corner of my eye. A familiar face here, a recognizable gait there. But as the autumn nights grew longer and the clinic's halls emptier, those glimpses became impossible to ignore. 8 years I'd been at this rural clinic, a lifetime really. I knew every creak of the old building, every flickering fluorescent light. The night shift had become my domain, a quiet world where I could make my rounds in peace, tending to the handful of overnight patients we kept. It was late October when I first saw Mr. Johnson. He'd passed away 2 weeks prior. Pneumonia that his frail 90-year-old body just couldn't shake. I was charting at the nurse's station when movement caught my eye. There he was, shuffling down the hall in that blue and white striped robe he always wore, IV pole in hand. I blinked hard, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks. When I looked again, the hallway was empty. Just the wind, I told myself, rattling an empty wheelchair or something. But deep down, I knew better. The encounters grew more frequent as November's chill set in. Mrs. Takanawa, who'd succumbed to a stroke in the spring, appeared seated in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine as if waiting for an appointment she'd never keep. Little Tommy Brooks, taken by leukemia far too young, peeked around doorways, giggling silently before vanishing. I kept it to myself, of course. Who would believe me? The other nurses already thought I was odd for preferring the solitude of nights. No need to give them more reason to whisper. Besides, these visits, they weren't menacing. If anything, they felt comforting, like old friends stopping by to check on me. But comfort turned to unease the night I heard them speak. It was a particularly brutal shift. We'd lost 2 patients before midnight, a car crash victim and an elderly man with heart failure. I was making my final rounds, bone-weary and emotionally drained, when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. "Nurse, please." I froze, my hand on a door handle. The voice had come from behind me, from the room of Mrs. Clear, who had died peacefully in her sleep just last week. Slowly, I turned. There she was, sitting up in her old bed, pale and translucent in the dim light, her eyes cloudy with cataracts in life, now shone with an unnatural clarity. "I need your help," she said, her voice a dry rustle like autumn leaves. "We all do." My throat closed up. This was different. This was real in a way the other sightings hadn't been. I wanted to run, to scream, to hide in the supply closet until dawn chased away whatever madness this was, but I couldn't move. "What do you need?" I managed to croak out. Mrs. Clear's face softened into a sad smile. "To be heard," she said. "To be remembered. You're the only one who can see us, dear, the only one who hasn't forgotten." As if summoned by her words, other figures began to materialize in the hallway. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Takanawa, little Tommy, and dozens more patients I'd cared for over the years. Lives I couldn't save despite my best efforts. They didn't crowd me or reach for me with spectral hands. They simply stood there, watching with eyes full of a longing I couldn't quite understand. "We're not here to harm you," Mr. Johnson said, his voice stronger now than it had been in his final days. We need someone to know that we mattered, that our lives and our deaths meant something." I felt tears streaming down my face, my clipboard clattering to the floor. "Of course, you mattered," I whispered. "I remember all of you. How could I ever forget?" As I spoke, I realized it was true. Each face before me carried a story, a life I'd been privileged to be a part of, even if only at the end. The weight of those memories, the grief I'd never fully processed, came crashing down. I sank to my knees, surrounded by the spectral crowd. And there, in the darkest hour of the night, I began to talk. I spoke of Mr. Johnson's jokes, of Mrs. Takanawa's fierce love for her grandchildren, of Tommy's bravery in the face of endless treatments. I recounted final words, shared secrets, and moments of grace I'd witnessed in this very building. As I spoke, the apparitions seemed to grow more solid, more present. They nodded, smiled, and sometimes wept along with me. It was catharsis, for them and for me. I don't know how long I knelt there, pouring out 8 years of bottled-up emotion. When I finally looked up, pale dawn light was creeping through the windows. The hallway was empty once more, but the air felt lighter somehow, cleaner. I pulled myself to my feet, exhausted, but strangely at peace. As I gathered my scattered papers, I caught a glimpse of movement in a darkened room. But this time, I didn't feel fear. Instead, I smiled and whispered, "Sleep well. You're not forgotten." Since that night, I've continued to see them. Occasionally, a familiar face in a mirror, a comforting presence during a difficult case. But they no longer seek me out, no longer plead for acknowledgement. I've started a journal, recording the stories of those we've lost, not just names and dates, but the little details that made them human, the lives they lived, the love they shared, the marks they left on the world. It's not much, but it's a way to honor their memory, to ensure that even in this small rural clinic, no life passes unmourned or unremembered. Some nights, when the halls are quiet and the veil between worlds feels thin, I could swear I hear a whispered thank you on the wind. And I know that, in remembering them and carrying their stories, I've found a way to help my patients one last time. A new school year had just started, and I was the fresh face at Cedar Heights High School in upstate New York, starting my junior year. I didn't know a single soul there, and it was pretty daunting. By that age, everyone already had their cliques, and finding your way in felt like a losing battle. The hardest part of the day for me was lunchtime. At Cedar Heights, juniors weren't allowed to leave campus during lunch breaks. Only seniors could. That meant I was stuck in the cafeteria, facing the challenge of finding a place to sit. When lunch rolled around, I entered the cafeteria with my tray, scanning the room for an open seat. It was packed, and the idea of squeezing into an unfamiliar table didn't sit well with me. Just when I thought I was out of options, I noticed a small table near the far corner with only 2 students sitting at it. They looked approachable, so I walked over and asked if I could join them. One of them nodded and said, "Sure." The 2 turned out to be fraternal twins named Adrian and Mateo. They had dark hair and sharp features that hinted at some Mediterranean heritage. They introduced themselves and made small talk with me, which put me at ease. I wasn't expecting much, but Adrian casually invited me to hang out with them later that evening. Figuring it couldn't hurt to make some friends, I accepted and exchanged numbers with them before heading home. After school, I dropped off my bag and got a text from Adrian. He said they were meeting up around 9 p.m. at an old abandoned quarry not far from my neighborhood. The school day had been exhausting, but since it was a Friday and I didn't have anything better to do, I agreed. The idea of meeting someone at night in such a creepy place wasn't ideal, but I chalked it up to them wanting to show me a cool hangout spot. When 9 p.m. rolled around, Adrian texted to confirm if I was still coming. I replied that I was leaving in a few minutes and asked for the exact location. He sent me a pin drop, and it was deeper into the quarry than I expected. But I didn't overthink it. I put on a hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out into the night. As I walked, I began to second-guess my decision. The quarry was notorious for being a spot where people dared each other to go but rarely stuck around. Still, I pressed on and eventually reached the edge of the site. I texted Adrian to ask where they were, and he replied that they were hanging near a large boulder by the water. He sent another location, and it led me into the trees near the quarry. The flashlight on my phone barely illuminated the trail, and every little sound made me jump. I called out their names a couple of times, but the only response was the faint crunching of footsteps nearby. "Is someone there?" I shouted, trying to keep calm. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. At that moment, I realized something was off. My gut told me to leave, so I turned around and started heading back toward the road. Before I could get far, I heard someone running behind me. The footsteps went from cautious to a full sprint, and then a hand grabbed me from behind, nails digging into my shoulder. I struggled against the grip as a voice shouted, "Don't let him get away!" Panic kicked in, and I managed to wrestle free. Adrenaline took over as I bolted toward the road. The moment I broke through the trees, the footsteps behind me stopped. I kept running, my heart pounding, until I made it back home. I told my parents everything, showing them the scratches on my shoulder. They were furious and wanted to call the police immediately, but I convinced them to let me report it to the school first. The next morning, armed with Adrian's text, I met with the school administrators. After reviewing the evidence, they decided to expel both twins. My parents blocked their numbers on my phone, and I didn't argue. The school promised to keep me informed if they tried to come near the campus again. A week later, I was finally starting to relax, convincing myself it was all behind me. But one night, I woke up to a chill in my room. My window was open, and the cold night air was flooding in. I never left my window open, especially not in the middle of January. I walked over to shut it, glancing down at the small ledge outside. It wasn't unusual to think someone could climb up there. It was something my dad always said I could use as an escape route in case of a fire. But it still unsettled me. I went to my parents' room to ask if they had opened my window for some reason. My mom, half asleep, sat up and said, "Of course not." She woke my dad, but he dismissed it, thinking I was overreacting. Frustrated, I went back to my room and stopped in my tracks. My door, which I had left wide open, was now slightly ajar. My pulse quickened as I pushed it open just enough to see inside. The beam from my phone flashlight swept across the room, and then I saw it, a shadowy figure hiding behind the door. I froze in place for what felt like an eternity before screaming at the top of my lungs. My dad came running down the hall as the figure bolted for the window and jumped out. By the time my dad looked outside, whoever it was had disappeared into the night. He called the police while I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking. The officers arrived and listened to my story, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested installing cameras and keeping all the doors and windows locked. To this day, I'm convinced it was one of the twins, or both. For months, I lived in fear, jumping at every noise. Thankfully, nothing like it ever happened again. But looking back, I can't believe I was so naive. I should have trusted my instincts that night in the cafeteria and avoided them altogether. Sophomore year of high school, 2009. It was art class during the last period, and we had a substitute teacher. It was one of those gray, gloomy days where the sky looked like it could open up at any moment. The substitute was a middle-aged man, probably in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair. When he called attendance, he paused briefly when he got to my name, giving me a look that felt longer than it needed to be. I shrugged it off, figuring he was just distracted. He told us to work on our sketching assignments while he sat at the desk in the corner. 30 minutes went by, and he got up, saying he'd return shortly. He disappeared into the hallway. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, I packed my things and headed toward my locker. But when I tried to open it, the lock wouldn't budge. I tried my combination multiple times, but it didn't work. Annoyed, I went to find the substitute, who was now in the main office. I explained the situation, and he told me he'd grab the master key to help. He walked back with me toward my locker, chatting casually as if we were old friends, which felt a little odd. When we got there, he used the master key to open it, but as he did, he leaned in closer to me than I was comfortable with. His arm brushed mine, and I stepped aside, pretending not to notice. I quickly grabbed my bag and started to leave, but he stopped me, saying I should check to make sure everything was still in my locker. His tone made me uneasy, but I complied to avoid making a scene. As I sifted through my things, I felt his hand rest lightly on my shoulder. I froze for a second, but then shrugged it off, pretending it was nothing. I told him everything looked fine and thanked him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, he said he needed to lock the locker back up and would wait until I left. Feeling pressured, I hurriedly put my things away and closed the locker. He locked it and smiled at me, but his expression felt off. Too personal, too intense. I turned to leave and headed for the stairwell, but as I walked down the hall, the fluorescent lights above me flickered, and then everything went dark. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I fumbled for my phone in my bag to use as a flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. Panicking, I started walking faster, then broke into a run. I reached the stairwell and glanced back for just a second. In the dim emergency light coming from the exit sign, I saw him standing at the other end of the hall, watching me. He didn't say a word, just stood there. I bolted down the stairs, my bag thumping against my back, and didn't stop until I was outside. The rain had started pouring by then, soaking me as I ran off school grounds. I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. As I walked the rest of the way, dripping wet, I replayed what had happened. The way he lingered, the way he touched my shoulder, the way he seemed to wait for me in the dark. It all felt deliberate. To this day, I don't know if the lock really malfunctioned or if he had done something to it. I never told anyone about that day, not my parents, not my friends. I felt too embarrassed, too unsettled to bring it up. Even now, it's something I keep to myself, trying not to dwell on what his intentions might have been. When I was in high school, I wasn't what you'd call the most involved student. I stayed out of sports and most extracurricular activities, but I did end up joining the school band. Truth be told, I wasn't particularly passionate about music, but in my school, the band was one of the easiest electives to pass. It was that, art, or chorus. And between those options, band felt like the least effort. Our band teacher, Mr. Carlton, was a laid-back guy. He had been teaching music for over 20 years and clearly loved his job, but he wasn't overly strict. His grading system reflected that. As long as you showed up to class, attended your weekly instrument lessons, and made even a half-hearted effort to participate, you'd secure an easy A. Naturally, a lot of us in the band took advantage of this. We'd slack off, skip practice here and there, but still pass without issue. However, one semester, I realized too late that I had missed 3 of my weekly lessons. Those lessons counted heavily toward our grades, and with the quarter almost over, I was sitting at a solid B instead of my usual effortless A. For most students, that might not have been a big deal, but for me, a B was unacceptable. I needed to keep my grades up for the slim chance of getting a scholarship somewhere, anywhere, that would take me. I decided to talk to Mr. Carlton after class one day. He was sitting at his desk, sifting through sheet music, when I approached him. I explained my situation, asking if there was any way I could make up the missed lessons. At first, he seemed reluctant. He muttered something about how lessons were scheduled for a reason and how it wasn't fair to the other students to bend the rules. But after a long pause, he sighed and said, "All right, fine. You can make up the lessons, but you'll have to do it during lunch. The only place available is the old practice rooms in the basement. It's quiet down there, and you won't disturb anyone." I eagerly agreed. I didn't care where I had to practice as long as I could get those grades back up. The next day, I showed up to the music room during lunch with my trumpet in hand. Mr. Carlton pointed me toward a narrow staircase at the back of the room that I had never noticed before. "Head down there, pick any open room, and practice for at least 30 minutes, he said. "I'll swing by to check on you at some point." The staircase led to the basement level of the music department. It wasn't a place students frequented often. The walls were lined with old, peeling posters from past school concerts, and the air felt damp and musty. The lighting was dim, with flickering fluorescent bulbs casting uneven shadows across the floor. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long hallway with doors on either side. Each door led to a small, windowless practice room, no bigger than a storage closet. Some of the rooms were crammed with music stands, folding chairs, and dusty boxes. Others were mostly empty, save for a piano or a few scattered sheets of music. I chose a room near the middle of the hallway, propped the door open with a chair, and set up my sheet music on a stand. I figured I'd play for a few minutes, just enough to say I practiced, and then spend the rest of the time scrolling through my phone. I had only played a few notes when I noticed how eerily quiet it was down there. The thick concrete walls muffled all sound, making it feel like I was completely cut off from the rest of the school. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning was absent. It was just me, my trumpet, and the occasional creak of the old building settling. About 10 minutes in, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the hallway into total darkness. At first, I thought it was just a minor power glitch. I instinctively reached for the light switch in my practice room, flicking it up and down. But nothing happened. The basement remained pitch black. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, holding it up to illuminate the tiny room. That's when I noticed something strange. The door to my practice room, which I had left propped open, was now completely closed. I hadn't heard it move, but there it was, shut tight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it must have been a draft, or maybe the chair I used wasn't heavy enough to keep the door open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I opened the door slowly and stepped into the hallway. The dim light from my phone barely lit up the space in front of me. As I moved toward the staircase, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took a few cautious steps in that direction. The scraping grew louder, followed by a low, guttural grunt. I froze. The sound wasn't like anything I'd heard before, half animal, half human. I turned off my phone's light and pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid whoever or whatever was making those noises would hear it. I stood there in the dark, straining to hear any other sounds. After a moment, I heard the distinct sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floor. Then a door creaked open, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps heading toward the hallway. I panicked. Without thinking, I darted into the nearest practice room and shut the door behind me as quietly as I could. The room was even darker than the hallway, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, pausing just outside the door to the room I was hiding in. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? Call for help? My phone had no signal in the basement, and even if it did, I wasn't sure I wanted to risk making any noise. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved past my room and continued down the hallway. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before daring to move. Just as I reached for the door handle, I felt a presence behind me. It was the kind of sensation that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, like you're being watched. I spun around, holding up my phone for light, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, with hunched shoulders and empty, hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me, letting out a guttural growl. I screamed and threw myself at the door, fumbling with the handle before finally yanking it open and sprinting into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was back upstairs in the music room, gasping for breath. Mr. Carlton looked up from his desk, startled. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked. I tried to explain what I had seen, but my words came out jumbled and frantic. He called security, who searched the basement, but found nothing out of the ordinary, just a few overturned chairs and some scattered sheet music. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that basement. Was it a prank, a hallucination, or something far more sinister? All I know is that I never went back down there again, and every time I pass the music room, I feel a chill run down my spine. Late one night, my friends and I concocted what we thought was the ultimate adrenaline-pumping plan, breaking into the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The building had been shut down for decades, its once pristine facade now overgrown with ivy and cracked with time. It was the kind of place you'd hear about in ghost stories, the perfect backdrop for a daring late-night adventure. Our entry point was a boarded-up side door that had partially rotted away. All we had to do was pry off the remaining planks and squeeze through the narrow gap. It sounded easy enough, but the real challenge lay in not getting caught. Local legends claimed the place was haunted, but more realistically, the town council had placed security cameras around the property after several vandalism incidents. Before we made our move, we spent a good 20 minutes hiding behind bushes, scanning for any signs of patrols or motion-activated lights. Satisfied that we were in the clear, we darted across the overgrown lawn and reached the side entrance. With a crowbar we'd borrowed from one of our garages, we pried off the wooden planks as quietly as possible. Once the gap was wide enough, we took turns shimmying inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a damp, musty odor mixed with the faint scent of old wood and decaying paper. We switched on our flashlights, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. The church was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We decided to split up to explore the building. There were 5 of us in total, so we paired off, leaving one person, Trevor, to stand watch near the entrance in case we needed a quick escape. My partner for the night was Chris, my oldest friend, and the one who had initially suggested this whole idea. Chris and I headed toward the nave, our footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The pews were still intact, but covered in a thick layer of dust. Some had collapsed under their own weight, their splintered remains scattered across the floor. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with depictions of saints and angels, were now cracked and dulled, their colors muted by decades of grime. As we moved toward the altar, I noticed a strange symbol carved into the wood of the pulpit. It looked like a star enclosed in a circle, surrounded by indecipherable markings. "Hey, check this out," I whispered, pointing at the carving. Chris leaned in, his flashlight illuminating the strange design. "Creepy," he muttered. "Probably just some wannabe cult stuff. You know how people are." I nodded, though the sight of it left an uneasy feeling in my stomach. Meanwhile, the others were exploring different parts of the church. Brandon and Roland had ventured into the bell tower, their voices faintly audible as they joked about ringing the bell to freak out the entire neighborhood. Meanwhile, Sarah, our most fearless friend, had decided to explore the basement alone. As Chris and I continued our search, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah. "Found something weird. Come to the basement." I showed the message to Chris, and we quickly made our way to the stairs leading down. The basement was even darker and more decrepit than the main floor. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with crumbling books and artifacts covered in cobwebs. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Over here," she replied, her flashlight beam flickering in the far corner. We made our way toward her and found her standing in front of an old wooden chest. It was massive, with intricate carvings along its edges and a rusted metal lock. "Think we should open it?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with excitement and unease. Chris didn't hesitate. "Hell yeah, why else are we here?" Using a screwdriver he'd brought along, Chris managed to break the lock. The lid creaked loudly as we lifted it, revealing what looked like old church relics. A chalice, a small wooden cross, and a tattered book with a black leather cover. The book immediately caught Sarah's attention. "This looks ancient," she said, carefully picking it up. The cover was adorned with the same symbol we'd seen on the pulpit. "Don't open it," I blurted out, surprising even myself. "Why not?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know," I admitted. "It just feels wrong." Chris scoffed. "Come on, it's just a book. What's the worst that could happen?" Ignoring my hesitation, Sarah opened the book. Its pages were filled with handwritten text in a language none of us recognized, accompanied by strange illustrations of hooded figures and arcane symbols. As we stood there trying to make sense of it, we heard a loud bang from upstairs. All three of us froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. Chris shrugged, his bravado visibly shaken. "Maybe it's just Brandon and Roland messing with us." We decided to head back upstairs to regroup, but as we reached the top of the stairs, we found Trevor waiting for us, his face pale. "Guys, we need to leave, now," he said, his voice trembling. "What happened?" I asked. Trevor pointed toward the main doors. "I saw someone, or something, outside. It was just standing there, staring at me, and it wasn't one of us." Before we could respond, another bang echoed through the church, louder this time. It sounded like it had come from the bell tower. Moments later, Brandon and Roland came rushing down the stairs, their faces filled with panic. "There's someone up there!" Brandon shouted. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Roland shook his head. "We don't know. We thought it was just the wind at first, but then we saw, I don't know, a shadow, a figure, whatever it wasn't human." Panic set in as we all realized the same thing. We weren't alone in the church. "Let's get out of here," Trevor urged, already heading for the exit. We didn't argue. Grabbing the book, Sarah led the way as we sprinted toward the side door. Just as we reached it, we heard a deep, guttural sound, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We didn't stop to look back. One by one, we scrambled through the narrow gap in the door, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Once outside, we ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were far from the church. When we finally slowed down, we looked at each other, our faces pale and our bodies trembling. No one said a word as Sarah held up the book, its strange cover glinting in the moonlight. "What do we do with this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. No one had an answer, but one thing was certain: we had unleashed something that night, and whatever it was, we knew we hadn't seen the last of it.